happy to have you here.
Yeah, nice to be in Georgia.
Yes, thank you for coming in your professional and personal capacity. That's
Right.
very nice.
Right.
And our audience knows that you are one of the foremost experts on minimum wage in Europe especially. So the first question we would have would be, why is minimum wage important? Why have government regulate what wages people receive?
Well, simply speaking, I think it's a basic human right. I mean, you can even look to the Declaration of Human Rights, which say that if you are working full time and you get a certain money, wage for your work, you should be able to afford your needs. So I think it's a basic human right that everyone should get a minimum pay where he or she could live with. And so we also talk about kind of living wage, which is exactly the expression for a wage where you can make your needs.
And minimum wage has a very long history in Europe.
Yeah.
If you can give us maybe the rationale, when and in what context it emerged and where it is now.
Okay. I mean, when we look to the European landscape, we have two different systems of minimum wage regimes, I would call them. One is where really the state is defining a certain minimum wage. Let's say, for instance, take France is a very good example because they have a very old minimum wage already going back to the 1950s. And they say, for instance, now, roughly speaking, around 10 euros per hour is a minimum wage. So nobody is allowed to work for less.
Minimum wage as an idea has a great history in Europe. Yeah,
it has a great history. We have a lot of countries where minimum wage regimes, statutory minimum wages set by the state, are already going back to the 1950s. Even in the United States, I mean, was one of the first big countries in the world introducing minimum wage already in 1938 with fair labor standard labor laws at that time. So it is, what to say, for modern Western capitalist societies, I think it's really a basic issue that you have a wage floor in your country, that it's not allowed to exploit labor for very poor wages. There were a few exceptions in countries like the Nordic countries and also Germany, where I come from, where you traditionally have strong collective bargaining agreements between unions and employers associations, which also set minimum wages. So these countries, sometimes they don't have a national, but they have negotiated minimum wages. But in Germany, we introduced a minimum wage quite recently in 2015. And the reason was that the former system about wage agreements does not work anymore, especially in the low wage sectors. We had a lot of problems with very low wages. And I mean, in the end, the state has to pay for these guys anyway, because if they have not enough money for survive, then the state has to jump in. And therefore, it's a better system to have a proper minimum wage, would at least give you a basic standard. And Germany introduced it, and we were very successful in introducing this system.
So, in relation to that introduction, to that reform,
Yeah.
there are some of the concerns usual in this society,
Right. Yeah.
and there were these concerns, I know, in Germany as well.
Absolutely.
One of the concerns is, for example, that jobs will be lost. And were these concerns in place at the time, and did they materialize?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We had a very harsh and controversial debate in the 2000s about the introduction of a minimum wage. And there were, as you said, there were also, in particular, a lot of economists who really drawing catastrophic pictures on the wall saying there were serious calculations in academic journals where economists say, oh, we will lost about 1 million jobs, or sometimes even 1.5 million. So they had all kinds of figures. And in the end, nothing happens, to be honest. I mean, we have much more jobs than we had before. And all these economists really standing there with their models and saying, well, but this is not happening in reality. We do not see any job loss. And if we took seriously the more recent modern literature, academic literature also on minimum wage, I think there is more and more a common understanding that this old simplistic view on minimum wages, that just minimum wages will create unemployment, is simply not true. It's simply not true. It simply did not work out. On the opposite, I mean, it really improves not only the living situation for the workers, but it also might help the economy to increase productivity. It stabilizes the demand side, so it also has positive economic functions for the society.
And so what are the benefits that were brought in Germany after that? Were more jobs created, for example? More distribution of wealth, for sure?
Yeah, we see, first of all, we see a declining inequality in wages. Absolutely. We see that the low wage earners, they really got a higher share. We also see, interestingly, a decline of the gender pay gap, because most of the workers working in these very low wage sectors, the large proportion are female workers. So, and the gender pay gap also comes a lot from these different different sections of the economy. So I would say it really has improved the working life of many workers, and at the same time we find more jobs. The people are more willing also to work in these service sector jobs because they have better conditions, simply speaking. It's not everything is perfect, of course, and we had also a debate after we introduced the minimum wage that it's fine to have a minimum wage, but still the level was seen as much too low. And I was one agreeing to these critics, and we had now a debate that we need really to increase the minimum wage to make it a real living wage. And we will have it very recently in October. We will have really a jump in the minimum wage. The minimum wage will increase for more than 20%. And again, we have this debate about, oh, will this create unemployment and so on. But I'm pretty sure that, I mean, it's really something good for the economy. It pushes the economy instead of destroying jobs. It's very clear.
One question in relation to developing countries like Georgia.
Right.
Because Germany might have a very well set up taxation, income verification system. Are there risks in more of a developing context? And what are the examples of you are aware of how minimum wage has worked in Eastern Europe, where the context is more or less is similar to ours?
Yeah, first of all, I think in Eastern Europe, they also have a very core function for the overall wage system, because their collective bargaining and other forms of collective regulation of wages are still rather weak. I think
like here.
It's probably the same in Georgia. So even so, the minimum wage set by the state is even more important. And if I mean set by the states, it's of course a democratic process behind it. It's not just that the minister saying, oh, okay, what kind of minimum wage I want to have, but it is, first of all, it is a consultation process with employers, with trade unions and so on. And there are also some calculations you can make, some orientations you can give. For instance, a very important calculation is how the minimum wage is related to the average wages in your country. And for instance, there is more or less becoming more and more a kind of standard that at least 50% of the average wage should be an adequate number for a minimum wage in your country. So I would say the experiences are rather positive. And if we're coming to Georgia, of course, then you also have to talk about the problem of the big informal sector, because usually the minimum wage is only in the formal sector. But nevertheless, we know from all kinds of studies on minimum wages in developing countries that even if the minimum wage is not paid 100%, it has a very important meaning. In literature, it's called the so-called lighthouse effect.
It lifts everybody.
Yeah, like it lifts everybody. Lighthouse, and it shows you the number. And I mean, if in your country everyone knows, okay, this is, you need to have one. I mean, what is very important. You have different minimum wage regimes in developing countries. Some have very complicated systems with thousands of minimum wages, regional, sectoral, and so on, and nobody knows what really the minimum wage is. So this does not work. What you need is to have a clear figure so that everyone, every worker, every citizen in your country knows, okay, this is what I at least need to get for my job. This is a figure, let's say, I don't know, 500 lari or 700, whatever you take.
It will be.
But a clear figure. And then even in the informal sector, I mean, the people know, okay, at least I should get this minimum wage. And when they bargain, I mean, also the informal sector is not without rights and without rules.
Yeah, they can bargain.
And they can bargain, and they know they can use this figure. And here you see very clearly that also minimum wages have a very important positive effects for informal economy.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So one last question I have is about Europe.
Right.
Lately, and that's my criticism usually of Georgian discourse in relation to Europe, we very often focus on Europe as a source of political rights and civic and political rights, but there's so much to say about Europe and welfare, prosperity, and labor rights. Right. And so what are the latest trends across Europe in relation to minimum wage?
Okay, may I start with a somewhat more broader view on the European integration, because for a long time people who are more dealing with social aspects criticize the EU for having a rather one-sided approach only to economic issues. They only talk about competitiveness and these kind of things, and ignore the social things, despite the fact that most of the national states have rather strong welfare state. But what we see more recently, let's say during the last 10 years or so, is that social issues start to play more and more a crucial role. And talking about the minimum wage, we just 2 years ago, the European Commission adopted even they proposed a European directive on what they call adequate minimum wages, because almost all countries in Europe have minimum wages, but sometimes they are rather low. And they only make sense, of course, if they fulfill their functions. So they need to have an adequate level. And of course, the interesting question is what means adequate.
In different countries,
in different countries, it could mean, of course, difference in different countries. But there are some general, let's say, ways how you can find a kind of orientation. And for instance, in that directive proposal, and the directive will be adopted in September by the European Council.
Okay.
It's now really for sure. It has been a long time of debates, but now it is at a final stage that they will adopt it. And in that directive, for instance, they say one way to calculate adequate wage could be to orient it to at least 50% of the average wage of a national country. So, and if this directive is adopted, I mean, all the member states are forced to make sure that their national minimum wages have an adequate level. And I think when it comes to EU enlargement and the debate you have in Georgia to become possibly in the future an EU member, I mean, the EU has the so-called acquis communautaire, so the basic values of the European Union. And it's very clear, it's not only about political or legal aspects or economic aspects, it's also about social aspects. So you need to have basic social rights for the citizens, you need to have basic worker rights for the workers to make sure, I mean, that's the self-understanding as what you might call a social market economy or whatsoever. So it's not just pure capitalism, it's a social market economy which is important, and here you need minimum wages as one basic institution for that.